Or are you guys going to continue working on it?
My hope and prayer is that Sebastian is still alive, yes. We're going to continue to work on this investigation, follow up every tip and lead that comes in. Some of this may revert back to us going over some things that we've already done for the sixth, seventh, or eighth time. A fresh set of eyes never hurt anything. We're going to continue to work to find Sebastian.
Your biological father and mother this past week, is that at their request, your request? Is that just re-interviewing them again?
That was at the request of law enforcement. It's not uncommon to talk to the family in investigations like this.
A former sheriff made a statement that changed everything. We saw him go into the house. We never saw him come out. That sentence wasn't commentary. It was a procedural boundary, and it turned a missing child case into something far more disturbing. February 2024, Sumner County, Tennessee. 15-year-old Sebastian Rogers vanished from his home in the middle of the night. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no screams. Just gone. But here's where it gets chilling. Cameras captured Sebastian entering the house that evening, taking out the trash, his bedroom light turning on. What the cameras never captured. Him leaving. Law enforcement deployed thermal imaging inside the walls. They searched a landfill. They coordinated multi-agency operations across waterways and terrain. And through it all, one question remained unanswered. If he never left on camera, where did he go? There's a 2-hour gap that night nobody can explain. A porch light that was always on, but wasn't. And a morning timeline that doesn't match what the cameras actually show. Drop a comment right now, where are you watching from? Let's see how far this story reaches. What you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about missing person cases. Before we dive into what happened that night, you need to understand who Sebastian Rogers was. Because in missing person cases, the victim's profile often determines how the investigation unfolds. And in this case, Sebastian's vulnerabilities made his disappearance even more alarming. Sebastian Paul Rogers, 15 years old. A teenager on the autism spectrum who was nonverbal at times, which meant communication wasn't always straightforward for him. He lived in Hendersonville, Tennessee, a quiet suburban community in Sumner County, just outside Nashville. The kind of place where neighbors know each other, where kids ride bikes down tree-lined streets, where a missing child isn't something people expect to wake up to. Sebastian wasn't a flight risk. He wasn't the kind of kid who'd run away on impulse. His autism meant he thrived on routine and predictability. Sudden changes, unfamiliar environments, or stressful situations could be overwhelming for him. Those who knew him described a boy who needed structure, who felt safest in familiar spaces. The idea that he would voluntarily leave his home in the middle of a cold February night, without shoes, without a coat, without any preparation, didn't align with who he was. His family structure was blended. Sebastian's biological parents were no longer together. His mother, Katie Proudfoot, had remarried. Sebastian lived primarily with his mother and stepfather, Chris Proudfoot, in the Hendersonville home. His biological father, Seth Rogers, remained involved in his life, though the custody arrangement meant Sebastian's day-to-day life centered around his mother's household. Like many blended families, dynamics can be complicated. Relationships shift. Roles aren't always clearly defined, and when a child goes missing from that environment, investigators pay close attention to those dynamics. Not because blended families are inherently suspicious, but because understanding the household structure helps establish baselines. Who had authority? Who made decisions? Who was responsible for Sebastian's care on any given night? Sebastian's routine was predictable. School, home, family time. He wasn't the kind of teenager sneaking out to meet friends or testing boundaries in typical adolescent ways. His world was smaller, more controlled. That predictability is exactly why his disappearance felt so jarring. Kids like Sebastian don't just vanish. They don't wander off into the night without a trace. Their routines anchor them. When Sebastian was reported missing on the morning of February 26, 2024, the community's reaction was immediate. Sumner County isn't a large metropolitan area. It's the kind of place where a missing child becomes everyone's emergency. Neighbors joined search parties. Local businesses shared his photo. Social media lit up with appeals for information. In those early hours, the assumption was straightforward. A vulnerable teenager, possibly disoriented, possibly lost. The hope was that he'd be found quickly, cold, but safe, somewhere nearby. Search teams fanned out across the neighborhood. Volunteers combed through wooded areas, checked sheds, knocked on doors. The community showed up in force because that's what communities do when one of their own goes missing. But as the hours turned into days, that initial hope began to crack. No sightings, no credible leads, no evidence that Sebastian had been seen by anyone outside the home after that evening. The searches expanded. Waterways were checked, drones were deployed. K9 units tracked scents that led nowhere. And slowly, the narrative began to shift. This wasn't a boy who wandered off and got lost. This was something else. Something that didn't fit the profile of a typical runaway or a disoriented child. The community's concern deepened into something heavier. Fear, confusion, and eventually, suspicion. What time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. Sebastian Rogers was a child who needed protection. His autism made him vulnerable in ways that most teenagers aren't. He relied on the adults in his life to keep him safe, to maintain the structure he needed, to ensure that his world remained predictable. On the night of February 25th, 2024, that world collapsed. And the question that would haunt investigators, the community, and eventually the nation, was simple. How does a boy like Sebastian just disappear from his own home without a single verified trace? February 25th, 2024. The last day anyone can confirm they saw Sebastian Rogers alive. The evening started ordinarily enough. The family went out to dinner at Texas Roadhouse, a popular chain restaurant known for its casual atmosphere, warm rolls, and family-friendly vibe. It was a Sunday night. Nothing unusual about the outing, no reported conflict, no signs of distress, just a family having dinner together. This detail matters because it establishes normalcy. In missing child investigations, the last known public appearance is critical. It's the final moment when independent witnesses, surveillance systems, and environmental factors can verify that the child was present, alive, and behaving in a manner consistent with their baseline. Texas Roadhouse provided that verification. Cameras captured the family leaving the restaurant. Timestamps locked in the departure time. The sequence was documented. The drive home was also captured. Neighborhood surveillance cameras tracked the family's vehicle as it returned to the Hendersonville residence. Again, nothing unusual. No stops, no detours, no indication of anything out of the ordinary. The family arrived home, and the evening transitioned from public space to private space. That transition is where documentation becomes sparse. Once inside the home, the timeline relies less on objective recording and more on statements. But there is one piece of footage that stands out. Sebastian is seen taking out the trash. This moment has been referenced repeatedly as the last confirmed visual of him. A figure, believed to be Sebastian, exits the house, walks to the trash area, and completes the task. It's a mundane action, routine, the kind of thing teenagers do without thinking. But in hindsight, it became the final verified sighting. After the trash run, another detail appears on camera. The bedroom light turns on. That's significant because it indicates occupancy. Someone is inside the house, someone is in the bedroom. The light suggests activity, presence, continuation of the evening. From an investigative standpoint, this detail matters because it establishes that after the trash was taken out, movement continued inside the residence. The evening wasn't over. It was still unfolding. And then, nothing. What happens next is where the timeline fractures. Between approximately 7 p.m. and 9 p.m., there is a void. A 2-hour window that should be filled with detail but isn't. In missing child cases, investigators rely heavily on what are called the last normal hours. These are the final verified hours before a disappearance, when the child is presumed to be alive, present, and interacting with others in an ordinary way. Those hours are examined minute by minute. Who spoke to the child? What was said? Where did the child move within the home? What routines were followed or broken? Was there conflict? Was there discipline? Was there withdrawal or distress? This level of detail is not optional. It's foundational, because the last normal hours often contain the clues that explain what happened next. A change in behavior, an argument, a punishment, a moment of tension that escalated, or conversely, absolute normalcy that rules out internal conflict and points investigators outward. In the Sebastian Rogers case, that 2-hour window is described only in the most general terms. The phrase most commonly used is some variation of, "We had a good evening together." That statement appears early in interviews. is repeated in later interviews, and then functions as a substitute for detail. It's a conclusion, not a description. From an investigative standpoint, good evening is not a usable data point. It doesn't identify actions. It doesn't establish timelines. It doesn't clarify who was present, who interacted, or what Sebastian was doing at specific moments. It doesn't explain how the evening progressed from dinner to bedtime. It doesn't describe whether Sebastian ate again, watched television, played, argued, withdrew, or expressed distress. It simply labels the entire period as uneventful, but uneventful periods are rarely summarized so broadly in cases involving missing children. They're normally broken down precisely because normality itself must be proven, not asserted. Investigators expect to hear about routine, bedtime rituals, screen time, homework, snacks, interaction with family members. Deviations from routine are particularly important because they often explain why a night unfolded differently. Here, the routine is implied but not described. Bedtime is referenced but not anchored to actions. Even the time Sebastian supposedly went to bed varies between statements. In some accounts, bedtime is suggested to be around 9 p.m. In others, references imply activity later into the night. These inconsistencies aren't resolved by additional detail. They're masked by the absence of it. This is where the concept of structured omission becomes relevant. A structured omission is not the same as forgetting. Forgetting produces inconsistency. Structured omission produces uniformity. The same section of time is consistently glossed over. The same lack of specificity appears regardless of who is speaking or when. The omission becomes part of the narrative structure itself. It creates a smooth surface where friction should exist. When witnesses or caretakers consistently summarize a block of time instead of describing it, especially when that block immediately precedes a critical event, it raises a procedural red flag. This doesn't automatically indicate deception. There are benign explanations, memory stress, emotional overload, an assumption that the details are irrelevant. But when the same block remains undescribed, even as other parts of the timeline are revisited, clarified, or adjusted, the omission takes on structural significance. The 2-hour void sits precisely between the last confirmed movement, Sebastian taking out the trash, the bedroom light turning on, and the last claimed interaction before bed. It's the bridge that connects presence to absence. When that bridge is missing, the timeline cannot support weight. There's another detail from that evening that has drawn consistent attention: the porch light. According to multiple observations, the porch light was typically on during nighttime hours. It was part of the household routine, a standard safety measure, the kind of thing that happens automatically in most homes. You leave the porch light on so you can see who's at the door, so the exterior is visible, so cameras can capture movement if needed. On this particular night, the porch light was not on. From an investigative standpoint, this is not proof of wrongdoing. Lights fail, switches get flipped, power issues happen. But in cases where cameras are being relied upon to establish movement, lighting conditions are not incidental. Exterior lighting affects camera capture. A porch light that is usually on but is off on the night of a disappearance alters visibility at precisely the point where an exit would need to be documented. That doesn't mean the light was intentionally turned off. It means the absence of light compounds the absence of footage, and investigators are obligated to account for that. When a case hinges on whether a child left a residence, any factor that affects the ability to document that exit becomes relevant. The porch light being off doesn't explain what happened, but it does explain why what happened might not have been recorded. So here's where we are at the end of this evening. Sebastian is confirmed on camera entering the home. He's seen taking out the trash. The bedroom light turns on. Then there's a 2-hour window with no detail. The porch light that should be on is off. And the next morning, Sebastian is gone. If you're finding this as unsettling as I am, hit that like button. It helps more people see this story. The last known evening should be the most documented part of any missing child case. It should be filled with specifics, timestamps, actions, interactions. It should provide investigators with a clear picture of how the night unfolded and where things might have gone wrong. Instead, this evening is defined by what's missing: a 2-hour gap, a light that wasn't on, and a timeline that jumps from good evening to he's gone without explaining the space in between. In investigations, clarity prevents speculation. Vagueness invites it. And this, the morning of February 26, 2024, the day Sebastian Rogers was discovered missing. In missing child investigations, the morning a disappearance is discovered is often as important as the night before. Investigators study those first actions carefully, not to judge emotion, but to understand sequencing. What a person does first, second, and third under perceived emergency conditions tends to follow predictable patterns. Deviations from those patterns don't automatically indicate guilt, but they do signal that assumptions should be tested rather than accepted. According to statements, Sebastian was discovered missing in the early morning hours. The exact time varies slightly depending on the account, but the general time frame is consistent. Someone checked his room. He wasn't there. The bed may have appeared slept in, or it may not have. Details on that point remain unclear. What is clear is that at some point, the realization set in, Sebastian was gone. What happened next is where the timeline becomes difficult to reconcile. The first notable decision was not to call 911. According to available information, when Sebastian was discovered missing, the call made was not to emergency dispatch, but directly to law enforcement through a non-emergency or direct line. From a procedural standpoint, this is unusual but not unheard of. Some individuals believe contacting a known officer or department directly will speed response. Others misunderstand the role of 911 or feel more comfortable reaching out to someone they know. But investigators document this choice carefully because 911 calls serve multiple functions beyond dispatch. They create an immediate, time-stamped, recorded account of the caller's words, tone, and stated understanding of the situation. They capture real-time emotion. They preserve the first version of events before memory has time to reconstruct or refine details. Bypassing that system removes a layer of contemporaneous documentation. It's not inherently suspicious, but it is noted. The second action described is a neighborhood search. The claim is that Sebastian's mother drove around the neighborhood looking for him. On its face, that behavior is entirely consistent with a parent believing a child may have wandered off. It's instinctive, logical, the kind of thing any parent would do if they woke up and their child was missing. You grab your keys, you drive the streets, you look for any sign of them. But this claim is tested against objective data, and that's where the first clear discrepancy emerges. Neighborhood cameras reportedly show the vehicle leaving the house and traveling directly to the school, not looping through residential streets in a search pattern, not stopping at corners or checking nearby parks, not driving slowly while scanning sidewalks, a direct route from the house to the school. This creates a behavioral inconsistency. A panic search is typically chaotic and inefficient. Parents often retrace the child's known walking paths. They check nearby yards. They stop abruptly. They might even exit the vehicle to call out the child's name. The movement is erratic because the mental state is urgent and uncertain. A direct drive to a fixed destination suggests a different mental model. Not, my child is missing somewhere nearby, but there is a place I need to go. That doesn't establish intent or motive, but it does shift how investigators interpret the action. The school becomes the next focal point. According to the timeline, the vehicle arrives at the school shortly after the discovery that Sebastian was not in the house. The rationale offered is that Sebastian might have gone there, or that it was a logical place to check. Schools can represent safety and routine for children, especially those on the autism spectrum, so checking the school isn't inherently irrational. However, investigators examine not just destinations, but order. If a parent believes a child has wandered, nearby streets and immediate surroundings usually come before institutional locations, especially when law enforcement has already been contacted. The school wasn't next door. It required intentional travel, and the route taken wasn't exploratory. It was direct. After arriving at the school, the vehicle doesn't simply return home or remain there awaiting law enforcement. Instead, it departs via a secondary road. This route reportedly leads past areas that later become points of interest in the case. From a forensic standpoint, route choice matters. People under stress tend to default to familiar, efficient paths unless there is a reason to deviate. A deviation doesn't imply wrongdoing, but it does invite questions about purpose. Was the route chosen intentionally or incidentally? Was it habitual or situational? These are the kinds of questions investigators document without drawing conclusions. The dispatch timeline adds another layer of complexity. Official dispatch records indicate a specific time when law enforcement was formally notified and mobilized. But statements suggest awareness that officers were on their way before that dispatch time. This raises a sequencing question. How was that knowledge obtained, and through which channel? Investigators pay close attention to these overlaps because they help establish who knew what and when. Even small inconsistencies in timing can reveal whether a narrative is being reconstructed after the fact or recalled in real time. If someone says, "I knew the police were coming, but dispatch records show notification occurred later," that gap needs explanation. It might be a simple miscommunication, or it might indicate prior contact that wasn't disclosed. What ties these elements together is behavioral sequencing. Investigators are trained to look at the order of actions rather than the actions in isolation. Each step informs the next. In this case, the sequence is: discover child missing. Do not call 911. Contact law enforcement directly. Leave the house. Travel directly to school. Not neighborhood search pattern. Depart school via alternate route. That sequence does not mirror the most common panic response pattern seen in missing child cases, where immediate localized searching precedes institutional contact or routine destinations. It's not that the actions are impossible under stress, it's that they suggest a response guided by expectation or routine rather than by uncertainty. What's the weather like where you are today? Let me know below. It's important to stress what this analysis does and does not say. It does not claim there is a correct way to react to crisis. People respond differently under stress. Some freeze, some hyperfocus. Some cling to routine as a stabilizing mechanism. Behavioral analysis is not a tool for assigning blame. It is a tool for identifying where assumptions should be challenged. When actions align poorly with the stated understanding of the situation, investigators flag the inconsistency and seek clarification. In this case, the inconsistency remains unresolved in the public record. There has been no detailed reconciliation of the claim of neighborhood searching with the camera evidence showing direct travel to the school. There has been no clear explanation for bypassing 911 while simultaneously asserting urgency. There has been no clarification of why a routine destination was prioritized when an emergency was already acknowledged. From an investigative value standpoint, these questions matter because early morning actions often reflect what the person believes has happened. If someone believes a child has simply wandered, their behavior reflects that belief. If they believe something more serious has occurred, behavior often shifts toward notification and containment rather than searching. The sequence observed here sits uncomfortably between those two models. The result is not proof of anything. It is a behavioral anomaly. Investigators catalog anomalies because they help determine where to dig deeper. They prompt follow-up questions, re-interviews, and corroboration efforts. They also help investigators avoid anchoring prematurely to a single narrative. Ultimately, the morning timeline does not collapse under scrutiny, but it does not align cleanly either. The actions taken are not inherently incriminating, but they are not easily explained by panic alone. They suggest a response that had direction, not chaos, purpose, not desperation, and that distinction, subtle as it is, becomes critical when investigators try to reconstruct not just what happened, but what the people involved believed was happening at the time. Why follow a routine when the emergency has already begun? Now we arrive at the single most important piece of evidence in this entire case. Not a confession, not a witness, not a recovered item. A statement. A simple, procedural statement made by a former sheriff that changes the entire framework of the investigation. We saw him go into the house. We never saw him come out. That sentence is not commentary. It is not speculation. It is a procedural boundary, and in missing child investigations, it carries enormous weight. When a former sheriff makes that statement, he is not offering an opinion. He is describing what the recorded evidence shows, and more importantly, what it does not show. Cameras captured Sebastian Rogers entering the residence. They did not capture him leaving. That is not a gap in investigation. It is a gap in documentation. And in cases where surveillance is available, that gap becomes the foundation of everything that follows. Let's be clear about what this means. Cameras don't lie. People do. Cameras operate on fixed logic. They record what enters their field of view during the time they are active. They timestamp that footage. They store it. They do not interpret. They do not assume. They do not fill in blanks. If a camera is functioning, positioned correctly, and recording during a relevant time window, it will capture movement within its range. If it does not capture that movement, one of three things is true. The movement did not occur, the movement occurred outside the camera's field of view, or the camera was not recording. In this case, multiple cameras were operational. Some captured the family leaving Texas Roadhouse. Some captured the return to the neighborhood. Some captured Sebastian taking out the trash. Some captured the bedroom light turning on. These cameras were working. They were recording. They were positioned to capture exterior movement around the home. What they did not capture was Sebastian leaving. This is where the investigation should have pivoted immediately, because if cameras show entry but no exit, the last confirmed location of the child is inside the house, not outside, not in the neighborhood, not on a street or in a park, inside. From an investigative standpoint, this is not a theory, it is a data point. The child entered. The child did not exit on camera. Therefore, the residence becomes the focal point, not by assumption, but by protocol. Let's break down the footage that does exist. Texas Roadhouse. Cameras capture the family leaving the restaurant. This establishes that Sebastian was present, alive, and moving under his own power in a public space. Witnesses could corroborate this. The timestamp locks in the departure time. This is verified presence. Return home. Neighborhood surveillance cameras track the family's vehicle as it returns to the Hendersonville residence. Again, this is documented. The vehicle arrives. The family enters the home. Continuity is maintained from public space to private space. Trash run. A figure believed to be Sebastian is seen taking out the trash. This is the last confirmed visual of him. He exits the house, completes the task, and the assumption is that he re-enters. The bedroom light turning on shortly after supports that assumption. This moment is critical because it establishes that Sebastian was mobile, functional, and performing routine tasks. Bedroom light. After the trash run, the bedroom light turns on. This indicates occupancy. Someone is in the bedroom. Activity continues inside the residence. The evening has not ended. It is still unfolding. And then, nothing. No footage of Sebastian exiting the house. No camera capture of him walking down the driveway. No recording of him leaving through a door, a window, or any other exit point. No verified visual of him moving away from the property during the night or early morning hours. This is not a case where footage is missing across the board. Cameras were present. Some recorded activity, some recorded lighting changes, some recorded movement in the environment, but none recorded the exit that would be required to support a walkaway scenario. The former sheriff's statement reflects this reality. Entry is confirmed, exit is not. Now, law enforcement has used a specific phrase in relation to some of the footage, no evidentiary value. That phrase has been repeated in press conferences and interviews, often without clarification, and that lack of clarification has created confusion, speculation, and frustration. So let's define what no evidentiary value actually means. In legal and investigative terms, evidence has evidentiary value if it can be relied upon to establish a fact beyond reasonable dispute. For footage to have evidentiary value, it must meet certain standards. The timestamp must be accurate. The resolution must be sufficient to identify subjects or actions. The field of view must capture relevant activity. The footage must be authenticated and verifiable. When footage is classified as having no evidentiary value, it does not mean the footage doesn't exist. It does not mean it shows nothing. It means that from the standpoint of courtroom admissibility or investigative certainty, the footage cannot be relied upon to establish a fact. There are many reasons footage may be classified that way. Timestamp discrepancies, resolution too poor to confirm identity, field of view limitations that obscure critical details, inability to definitively identify the subject, lighting conditions that render the image unclear. However, in this case, that classification was made without a public explanation. The absence of explanation creates a vacuum, because the footage in question relates directly to the question of exit. When a case hinges on whether a child left a residence, any footage near doors, driveways, or exterior paths becomes central. If such footage exists but is dismissed as having no evidentiary value, investigators typically clarify why. They explain whether the issue is technical, contextual, or identification related. In this case, that clarification has not been made publicly. As a result, The public narrative assumes an exit occurred, while the documented record does not show one. This gap between assumption and documentation is where the camera problem becomes critical. And this is where the porch light becomes relevant again. Exterior lighting affects camera capture. Cameras rely on available light to produce clear images, especially at night. A porch light that is usually on but is off on the night of a disappearance alters visibility at precisely the point where an exit would need to be documented. If the porch light was off, cameras positioned to capture exterior movement may not have had sufficient lighting to produce usable footage. That doesn't mean an exit didn't occur. It means an exit may not have been recordable under those conditions. But here's the problem. If lighting conditions prevented cameras from capturing an exit, that should be stated clearly. It would explain why footage was deemed to have no evidentiary value. It would close the loop. Instead, the issue remains unaddressed and the gap persists. The contradiction at the heart of this case is this. The public narrative treats Sebastian's disappearance as a walkaway. Search teams fanned out into the community. Waterways were checked. Wooded areas were combed. The assumption, at least publicly, was that Sebastian left the house and went somewhere. But the documented evidence does not support that assumption. Cameras show entry. They do not show exit. The former sheriff acknowledged this directly. And yet, the investigation proceeded outward, as if the exit had been confirmed. This is not how protocol works. When cameras confirm entry but not exit, investigators do not assume the exit occurred off camera. They treat the residence as the last known location and work from there. They examine the interior. They interview occupants. They look for signs of concealment, disturbance, or alteration. They use tools like thermal imaging to rule out the possibility that the child is still inside, hidden or trapped. And in this case, they did use thermal imaging, which tells us that at some point, investigators took the camera problem seriously. They recognized that the absence of an exit on camera was significant enough to warrant searching the walls. But publicly, that significance was never articulated. The thermal imaging was mentioned briefly, then dropped. The camera contradiction was acknowledged by the former sheriff, then left unresolved. The phrase "no evidentiary value" was offered without context, then repeated as if it explained something. It didn't. It obscured. The camera problem is not about proving what happened. It is about defining what did not happen. According to the evidence as publicly described, Sebastian did not walk out of the house on camera. Until that changes, every theory that relies on an unseen exit rests on assumption rather than documentation. Cameras do not solve cases by themselves, but they establish boundaries. In this case, the boundary is clear. Entry is documented. Exit is not. That is why this case does not behave like an ordinary missing person investigation. The technology that should have resolved the simplest question, "Did he leave?" has instead created the most persistent problem. And until that problem is addressed directly, the investigation continues to operate on a conclusion that the recorded evidence does not visibly support. If the exit never appears on camera, why does the investigation behave as if it did? In standard missing child investigations, law enforcement follows a predictable progression. First comes perimeter verification: doors, windows, cameras, immediate surroundings. Then comes outward expansion: neighbors, streets, nearby terrain, bodies of water. What does not usually occur early, if at all, is the use of thermal imaging inside the walls of a residence. That tool is not part of routine protocol for walkaway cases. Its presence in this investigation is therefore not incidental. It reflects a specific internal concern, whether stated publicly or not. Thermal imaging is designed to detect heat differentials behind solid surfaces. It's used to locate people in concealed spaces: voids, crawl areas, false walls, sealed rooms. Fire departments use it to locate victims behind smoke-obscured barriers. Search teams use it to detect hidden bodies or recently occupied spaces. In residential investigations, it is most commonly deployed when investigators suspect that a person may be concealed, trapped, or hidden within the structure itself. It is not a tool used simply to check a house. It is used when there is a reason to believe something is there that cannot be seen. That is why its use in this case matters. Law enforcement entered the home and applied thermal imaging to the walls. This fact alone tells us something important. At some point early in the investigation, investigators did not treat the house as a place the child had merely passed through. They treated it as a possible terminal location. That does not mean they believed Sebastian was still inside at that moment. It means they could not rule out the possibility that he had never left. This creates a direct tension with the public framing of the case as a disappearance that extended outward into the community. Outward searches happened, and they were extensive. But the use of thermal imaging signals that internally, investigators were still interrogating the possibility of an in-house disappearance. In procedural terms, this is a fork in the road. Investigators do not take both paths unless the evidence forces them to. One of the most notable aspects of this step is what was not disclosed alongside it. There has been no public explanation of why thermal imaging was deemed necessary, no statement clarifying whether a warrant was obtained, no disclosure of what prompted the decision. In many jurisdictions, scanning the interior of a private residence with advanced imaging technology raises legal questions. Depending on the circumstances, it may require consent, exigent circumstances, or a judicial warrant. The absence of information on this point does not imply misconduct, but it does leave a critical procedural question unanswered. The lack of a disclosed trigger reason is equally significant. Investigators typically justify unusual investigative steps by referencing the evidence that led them there. For example, inconsistent statements, unexplained odors, structural anomalies, or conflicting timelines can all prompt a deeper structural search. In this case, none of those triggers have been articulated publicly. Instead, the action appears in isolation, disconnected from an explanation. That disconnect is where speculation begins, not because the public is reckless, but because the investigative sequence is incomplete. From a forensic standpoint, the decision to scan walls suggests concern about concealed space. Houses do not typically contain hidden rooms, but they do contain voids, behind drywall, under stairs, above ceilings, within crawl spaces. Thermal imaging helps determine whether those spaces show signs of recent occupancy or heat retention inconsistent with an empty structure. Again, this is not something done casually. It is done when investigators believe the absence of external evidence may be explained by internal concealment. This ties directly back to the camera problem. If cameras show entry but no exit, and if no verified exit is documented, investigators must account for that discrepancy. One way to do that is to consider the possibility that the child never exited the house. Thermal imaging becomes a logical step under that framework. It does not prove that scenario. It tests it. The fact that it was tested tells us that the scenario was taken seriously enough to warrant resources and intrusion. It is also important to note what thermal imaging does not do. It does not locate a person who is no longer present. It does not identify past events. It does not explain how or why something happened. It only answers one narrow question. Is there evidence of heat where there should be none? If the scan returns negative results, it does not eliminate the concern that prompted it. It simply rules out one possibility within that concern. In other words, a negative thermal scan does not mean investigators were wrong to suspect internal concealment. It means that particular hypothesis was not confirmed by that method. The use of thermal imaging also has implications for investigative prioritization. When such a tool is deployed, it usually occurs before the investigation fully commits to an external narrative. Once the house is cleared structurally, investigators may feel more confident expanding outward, but that confidence should be reflected in how the case is discussed publicly. In this instance, the public narrative moved outward without addressing the significance of the inward search. The result is a split perception, internally cautious, externally simplified. This split is not unusual in sensitive cases, especially those involving minors. Law enforcement often withholds details to protect the integrity of the investigation or the privacy of those involved. However, withholding context while allowing conclusions to form creates an information imbalance. The public hears that a child is missing. They see search teams in the community. They assume a walkaway or abduction. Meanwhile, internal actions suggest a different initial concern. When those two pictures do not align, trust erodes. From an investigative perspective, the value of the thermal imaging decision lies not in its result, but in its implication. It tells us that investigators were not comfortable relying solely on statements or assumptions. They sought objective confirmation that the house itself did not contain what the cameras could not show. That is a rational step when the last confirmed location of a child is inside that house. The absence of a public explanation does not negate the significance of the act. It amplifies it. Investigators rarely expose their doubts explicitly. They reveal them through their actions. In this case, the action was clear. The walls were searched. That choice communicates more than any press release could. The phrase often used in law enforcement circles applies here without embellishment. You do not search walls unless you think the child never left. That is not an accusation. It is a statement about investigative logic. Thermal imaging inside a residence is a response to evidence that does not support an external exit. It is a measure taken when the simplest explanation, walking away, fails to account for the data. Until the reason for that decision is explained, the thermal imaging step remains one of the clearest indicators of internal concern in this case. It stands as a quiet acknowledgement that at least at one point, investigators recognized that the disappearance might not have occurred outside the home at all. But here's where the contradiction deepens. While thermal imaging was being used inside the house, massive outward searches were also underway. Volunteers combed wooded areas, K9 units tracked scents, drones flew overhead, waterways were examined, and then the searches extended to a landfill. In the early phase of the Sebastian Rogers investigation, one figure consistently appears at the center of coordination and decision-making: the former sheriff. His role was not symbolic. He was actively involved in directing resources, aligning agencies, and setting the initial investigative posture. Under his leadership, the case moved quickly into a large-scale response. Multiple agencies were engaged, search grids expanded, waterways were examined, specialized tools were deployed. This was not a minimal response to a presumed walkaway. It was a mobilization that reflected uncertainty about where the case would ultimately lead. During this period, the former sheriff made at least one public statement that stands out in retrospect, a reference to evidence associated with a landfill search. The statement was cautious, framed in procedural language, and did not claim resolution. It acknowledged that material had been located and required further examination. In investigative terms, such a statement signals that a line of inquiry has produced something that cannot be dismissed outright. It does not mean the evidence is conclusive. It means it is relevant enough to pause, analyze, and verify. After that point, public references to landfill-related evidence ceased. There was no follow-up clarification, no confirmation of findings, no explanation of how that line of inquiry concluded. This absence is notable not because it implies concealment, but because it marks a break in narrative continuity. Investigations typically either advance a lead or formally close it out. Silence suggests neither occurred publicly. Shortly thereafter, the former sheriff died. The reported cause was a brain bleed following a fall. There has been no indication of criminal investigation related to his death. His remains were cremated, and no autopsy was conducted. Each of these facts, taken individually, can have benign explanations. Brain bleeds can follow falls. Families may choose cremation for personal or religious reasons. Autopsies are not mandatory in every death. From an investigative standpoint, none of these facts constitute evidence of wrongdoing. What matters is timing and consequence. The death occurred while the case was still active and unresolved. It removed the individual who had been the most visible and authoritative voice in the investigation's early direction. Leadership transitioned. Public communication patterns shifted. The tone of updates changed. The investigation did not stop, but it did change shape. This is where the concept of institutional discontinuity becomes relevant. Investigations are not only collections of evidence. They are processes guided by people. When a lead investigator or commanding officer exits abruptly, the investigation can lose momentum, change priorities, or be reframed. New leadership inherits not just the case file, but the decisions already made. They may choose to reaffirm those decisions or reassess them. Either way, continuity is disrupted. Under the former sheriff's leadership, the investigation appeared willing to pursue multiple hypotheses simultaneously. Internal actions such as the use of thermal imaging and the expansion to landfill searches suggested that investigators were not committed to a single narrative. After the transition, public-facing communication became more restrained, fewer specifics were offered. Emphasis shifted away from unresolved internal questions and toward generalized assurances that efforts continued. This change does not imply negligence or malfeasance. Leadership changes often bring different communication styles and risk tolerances. Some leaders prefer transparency, others prefer containment. Some prioritize public updates, others prioritize internal review. The effect, however, is the same. The public record becomes segmented. Early statements are not always reconciled with later silence. From an investigative value standpoint, this segmentation complicates external analysis. Statements made under one administration may not be reaffirmed or retracted under another. Leads referenced publicly may not be revisited publicly. The absence of contradiction does not mean agreement. It often means a decision to stop discussing certain elements altogether. The former sheriff's death also altered the evidentiary landscape in a subtle but important way. He was a witness to early investigative reasoning. He could have clarified why certain decisions were made, why certain tools were used, and why certain leads were prioritized. With his passing, that contextual knowledge became harder to access. Case files preserve actions, but they do not always preserve rationale. Rationale often lives in briefings, conversations, and judgment calls that are not fully documented. This loss of contextual continuity matters because the case contains several unusual early steps: thermal imaging, rapid multi-agency involvement, landfill searches. Without the ability to ask the initiating authority why those steps were taken, later interpretations are left to inference. Inference is not evidence, but it fills gaps when explanation is unavailable. It is also important to note that speculation surrounding the former sheriff's death has circulated widely. Much of that speculation is unfounded and emotionally driven. From a professional standpoint, such speculation must be set aside. Investigators do not assign meaning to deaths without evidence. What they do acknowledge is impact. The impact here was the removal of a central coordinating figure during a critical phase of an unresolved investigation. After the leadership transition, the investigation continued under new authority. Searches were refined, public briefings occurred, but the investigative posture appeared narrower. Whether that reflects a shift in internal conclusions or simply a change in communication strategy is not publicly known. What is observable is that certain lines of inquiry referenced early were no longer discussed. Institutional discontinuity does not mean an investigation is compromised. It means it evolves. Sometimes that evolution leads to clarity. Sometimes it leads to stagnation. In this case, the unresolved elements from the early phase, camera contradictions, the 2-hour gap, the rationale for internal searches, remain unresolved in the public domain. The death of the former sheriff coincides with that unresolved status. The investigative value of this section lies in understanding how leadership affects trajectory. Cases are not static. They are shaped by those who guide them. When that guidance changes abruptly, so does the shape of the investigation. Recognizing that shift is not an accusation, it is an acknowledgement of process. The former sheriff's role, his statements, and his sudden absence form a boundary between two phases of the case. The first phase was characterized by broad inquiry and visible action. The second phase has been characterized by reduced disclosure and unresolved questions. Understanding that boundary is essential to understanding why certain aspects of the case remain open, not because they were abandoned, but because the voice that introduced them is no longer present to explain their outcome. If you think this case deserves more attention, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're not letting this story disappear. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is a story about continuity, leadership, and the fragility of investigative momentum. When key figures are removed unexpectedly, the trajectory of a case can shift in ways that are difficult to track from the outside. What was prioritized under one leader may be deprioritized under another. What was disclosed may be sealed. What was questioned may be accepted. And in the case of Sebastian Rogers, that shift occurred at a moment when answers were most needed. Large-scale searches create an expectation of documentation. When hundreds of personnel are deployed, when multiple agencies are involved, and when advanced tools are used, there is usually a corresponding paper trail. Affidavits explain probable cause. Search warrants define scope and authority. Phone extractions establish communication timelines. Tower data maps movement. Forensic reports document findings, even when those findings are negative. In this case, the visible response was extensive. The publicly available record, however, remains strikingly thin. What has never been released is as important as what has been acknowledged. There is no publicly available affidavit laying out the foundational facts that justified early investigative decisions. There is no search warrant explaining the legal basis for specific searches or the parameters under which they were conducted. There is no phone dump detailing call logs, message timestamps, or device activity for the relevant period. There is no cell tower data showing pings, handoffs, or gaps that might corroborate or contradict stated movements. There is no comprehensive forensic report summarizing what was examined, what was ruled out, and what remains unresolved. This absence creates a contradiction between scale and transparency. On one side, the response suggests seriousness, multi-agency coordination, specialized searches, prolonged effort. On the other, the public record contains almost none of the documents that typically anchor such a response. The result is not simply frustration. It is a structural gap that affects how the case is understood. From an investigative standpoint, affidavits matter because they crystallize reasoning at a specific moment in time. They show what investigators believed, based on what evidence, and why certain actions were justified. Without them, it becomes difficult to reconstruct the early logic of the case. Search warrants serve a similar function. They outline what investigators were looking for and where they believed it might be found. The absence of these documents does not mean they do not exist. It means they have not been shared. That distinction is critical because public understanding relies on what is accessible, not on what may be sealed or internal. Phone dumps and tower data are often among the most clarifying elements in missing person cases. They provide objective timelines that are independent of memory. Calls made, messages sent, devices powered on or off, location changes. These data points can confirm or challenge narrative accounts. When such data are not released, even in redacted or summarized form, timelines remain dependent on recollection and interpretation. That dependence increases uncertainty, not because the data are unfavorable, but because their absence prevents verification. Forensic reports function as closure mechanisms. They tell the public and other investigators what was examined and what was ruled out. Even when reports conclude that nothing of evidentiary value was found, the documentation itself reduces speculation. It establishes that questions were asked and answered, even if the answers were negative. In this case, the lack of a released forensic summary leaves open the question of what was tested and what remains untested. The contradiction becomes sharper when placed against the visible effort. Searches of waterways, landfills, and surrounding areas are resource-intensive. They are not undertaken lightly. Such efforts are typically accompanied by internal documentation detailing why they were pursued and what thresholds were met to justify them. When those justifications are not shared, observers are left to infer reasons from outcomes. That is not how investigations are meant to be evaluated. The investigative value of transparency is often misunderstood. Transparency is not about satisfying curiosity or appeasing critics. It is about stabilizing the narrative around verified facts. When documents are released, even partially, they anchor discussion. When they are withheld entirely, discussion drifts. Alternative narratives emerge, not necessarily because people distrust law enforcement, but because they lack a reference point. In the absence of documentation, narrative substitution occurs. Observers fill gaps with assumptions, comparisons, and analogies. Some of these narratives are extreme. Others are procedural. All of them arise from the same source, a lack of accessible records. This is not unique to this case. It is a common dynamic in investigations where disclosure is limited for extended periods. From a law enforcement perspective, there are legitimate reasons to withhold documents. Ongoing investigations, protection of minors, safeguarding investigative techniques, legal constraints, all of these factor into disclosure decisions. However, prolonged non-disclosure carries its own costs. It allows unresolved questions to harden into perceived contradictions. It also complicates later clarification because early silence is often interpreted as avoidance rather than caution. The phrase, "no evidentiary value," used in relation to certain materials, exemplifies this problem. Without accompanying explanation, it becomes a dead end. Investigators know that no evidentiary value can mean many things. The public does not. When technical language is offered without context, it closes conversation instead of clarifying it. This transparency gap affects not only public perception but also external analysis. independent reviewers, journalists, and analysts rely on primary documents to assess investigative adequacy. Without those documents, evaluation becomes speculative. That speculation then feeds back into public discourse, reinforcing the very narratives that limited disclosure was meant to prevent. It is also important to recognize that a lack of released documentation does not mean a lack of investigative work. Files may exist, reports may be written, data may be analyzed. The issue is not whether the work was done, it is whether its contours are visible. Visibility matters because it allows the public to distinguish between unresolved questions and unexamined ones. In this case, the absence of foundational documents leaves that distinction blurred. Were phones analyzed? Was tower data reviewed? Were warrants obtained and executed? Were forensic tests conducted and ruled inconclusive? Each unanswered question invites another. Over time, the accumulation of unanswered questions becomes its own narrative, one that competes with the official account rather than complementing it. The investigative value of this section lies in identifying the consequences of non-disclosure. Transparency gaps do not prove misconduct. They do not establish negligence. They do, however, shape understanding. They determine whether a case is seen as unresolved because evidence is lacking or unresolved because documentation is inaccessible. Ultimately, the question that emerges is not accusatory, it is classificatory. Without access to the records that normally define investigative progress, it becomes difficult to determine the status of the case itself. Is it unsolved because the evidence has been exhausted, or is it simply undocumented in the public sphere, with conclusions and analyses remaining internal? Until that distinction is clarified, the absence of records will continue to drive alternative narratives, not because people prefer them, but because they are the only narratives available in the space left open by silence. Is this case unsolved, or simply undocumented? At a certain point in unresolved cases, the investigation no longer exists only inside law enforcement agencies. It expands outward into public space. Viewers watch interviews frame by frame. They replay timelines. They compare statements made weeks apart. They notice what is said, what is avoided, and what quietly disappears. This does not mean the audience becomes investigators. It means the audience becomes a mirror, reflecting which parts of the case remain structurally unclear. In the Sebastian Rogers case, that mirror has been active for months. Viewers have not focused randomly. They have returned again and again to the same unresolved points. The 2-hour gap in the evening, the absence of a recorded exit on camera, the porch light anomaly, the unusual use of thermal imaging, the morning behavior inconsistencies, the lack of released documentation. These are not emotional reactions, they are pattern responses. When large numbers of people independently fixate on the same gaps, it signals that those gaps have not been closed in a way that is intelligible from the outside. This is not a failure of the public. It is a predictable outcome of partial narratives. In well-documented cases, audience attention disperses. In cases where explanation stalls, attention concentrates. The audience does not invent the gaps, they respond to them. It is important to draw a clear line here. The audience does not determine guilt or innocence. They do not establish facts. They do not replace evidence. What they do is highlight where the official story lacks internal resolution. That role is not adversarial, it is diagnostic. Investigators, journalists, and analysts often rely on similar diagnostics internally, tracking which questions refuse to go away. One lesson from this case is that silence is not neutral. When foundational elements remain unexplained, they do not fade, they harden over time. Repetition gives them perceived weight, even when no new information is added. This is how speculation grows, not from imagination, but from absence. The audience fills space that records do not occupy. Another lesson is that behavior matters as much as statements. Viewers have focused on sequencing rather than sentiment. Who spoke when? Which actions came first? Which routines were followed despite an emergency? This mirrors professional analysis. Investigators look at order before motive. They examine behavior not to infer character, but to test whether actions align with stated understanding of events. The audience has instinctively done the same, not because they are trained, but because the timeline invites that scrutiny. There is also a lesson here about transparency thresholds. Transparency does not require full disclosure. It requires sufficient disclosure to stabilize interpretation. Redacted call logs, summarized tower data, and basic camera metadata would not solve the case on their own. But they would change the conversation. They would replace assumption with structure. When structure is absent, interaction becomes speculative. When structure is present, interaction becomes analytical. The audience's role, then, is not to accuse but to ask disciplined questions. And the quality of those questions matters. Questions rooted in procedure, timelines, documentation, sequencing, these are fundamentally different from questions rooted in emotion or suspicion. One advances understanding, the other amplifies noise. This case shows both at work. The challenge is to separate them. For viewers, there is a responsibility as well. Watching closely does not grant license to conclude. Pattern recognition must stop short of certainty. The difference between noticing a gap and filling it with assumption is the difference between analysis and narrative. This case demonstrates how easily that line can blur when frustration builds. Maintaining discipline in that space is difficult, but necessary. From a broader perspective, this case offers a lesson about modern investigations in the public eye. The internet does not forget. Statements persist. Early decisions are replayed long after context fades. When records are not released, early ambiguity becomes permanent ambiguity. Investigators may move on internally, but the public record does not move with them unless documentation follows. This creates a disconnect. Internally, a case may be active, evolving, constrained by legal realities. Externally, it appears frozen. The audience interprets that stillness as abandonment or concealment, even when neither is true. Bridging that gap requires not explanation of outcomes, but explanation of process. For the audience engaging with this case now, the most constructive role is not to search for villains, but to keep focus on unanswered procedural questions. What documentation exists? What was examined? What was ruled out, and how? These questions do not accuse. They clarify. They are the same questions investigators ask when reopening cold cases years later. Interaction matters here, but only when it is structured. Asking why, without anchoring it to a record, invites speculation. Asking what document would answer this invites progress. Viewers can contribute by shifting conversation away from conclusions and toward checklists. What record would close this gap? What data would confirm or contradict this timeline? Those are questions that move cases forward, even indirectly. There is also a lesson about patience. Cases that rely on documentation do not resolve quickly. Records move slowly. Legal barriers exist. Some answers come only when cases transition from active investigation to review. The audience's challenge is to remain engaged without escalating expectation beyond what process allows. Ultimately, the audience's presence in this case is neither a threat nor a solution. It is a factor. It reflects the health of the public narrative. Right now, that narrative remains unstable because too many foundational elements remain undocumented in public view. Stability does not require closure. It requires clarity. If there is a takeaway from the audience's role in this case, it is this. Attention should be directed not at constructing explanations, but at demanding alignment between actions and records. That demand is not hostile. It is procedural. It is how unresolved cases are eventually reframed, reviewed, and sometimes reopened. As viewers continue to watch, comment, and question, the most meaningful interaction is restraint, paired with precision. Focus on gaps, not guesses. On documents, not demeanor. On sequence, not speculation. That approach honors both the seriousness of the case and the limits of what public analysis can responsibly do. In unresolved cases, the audience does not solve the mystery, but it can help ensure that the mystery is defined accurately by what is known, what is unknown, and what remains to be examined.